Hello and welcome to this Islamic History and Thought lecture series session organized by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Thank you all for joining us today in person and online. My name is Orkhan Mir-Kasimov. I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker and discussant. Thank you both for joining us today. Professor Shahzad Bashir is our speaker today, and Professor Bashir hardly needs an introduction, at least in this building, since he is the Dean of the Institute for the Study of Islamic Civilizations. His work touches on various topics, including Sufism and Shiism, Messianic movements, corporeality, Persian and Urdu literature, modern transformations of Islamic societies, and history and historiography. He is the author of many books, articles, and book chapters. His most recent books are The Market in Poetry in the Persian World, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, and the digital book A New Vision for Islamic Pasts and Futures, published by MIT Press in 2022. He is an associate editor of the journal History and Theory, Studies in the Philosophy of History, and edits the book series Islamic Humanities, published by University of California Press. Reflection on the nature of history and historiography seems to be one of the central lines of Professor Bashir's research. His already mentioned book, A New Vision of Islamic Pasts and Futures, which is, by the way, available in open access, right? Has an interactive interface designed to let the reader actually experience the complex, nonlinear, paradoxical vision of history and perceptions of history, which are discussed in the book. He is currently working in two areas: a research project exploring a vast corpus of multilingual literature produced in India during the period between the middle of the 18th and middle of the 19th centuries, that has received little attention to date, and an extended argument for using anamorphic aspects of photography to theorize how we understand and narrate the past. So this brings us directly to the topic of today's talk. Professor Amanda Lanzillo, our discussant, held a PhD in history from Indiana University and is presently an assistant professor in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Right? She is a historian of South Asia, researching labor, technology, and social change within South Asian Muslim communities. Her book, titled Pious Labor, Islam, Artisanship, and Technology in Colonial India, is also available in open access through the University of California Press. It analyzes colonial era social, economic, and technological change in North India through the perspectives of Muslim workers and artisan laborers. To give you an idea of timelines, we will start with Professor Bashir's talk, which will last between 30 and 40 minutes, followed by a discussion led by Professor Lanzillo, and then questions from the audience. So the whole session should take between 1 hour and 1 hour and a half. For our online audience, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and please don't use the chat because we are not able to monitor that. And finally, a few housekeeping remarks. We are not planning on having a fire drill tonight. So if the alarm sounds, please make your way through the door and towards the main exit. And please also take a moment to ensure your mobile devices are switched off or are on silent. Thank you. So now I can pass the floor to Professor Bashir, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Mir-Kasimov. It's a pleasure to be here to participate in this event and to talk about these things. It's a special pleasure because these days about 150% of my time is spent on administrative work. So to get into things that kind of occupy the mind in other ways was both difficult to manage time-wise, but also truly a pleasure. So I'm really grateful for the invitation from the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and also very grateful to Professor Lanzillo for agreeing to comment. So I'm just going to give you very briefly what the plan of the talk is, so you have a map as we go forward, and then go through with it. So what I will talk about is highly experimental, open-ended, and entirely open to question. So what I'm hoping very much is that if you have objections to it, please say it. Basically, my hope would be to please engage with what I'm saying, but not in terms simply of accepting something that I'm providing or any kind of survey that I'm doing, but more with respect to the conceptual issues and ideas that I'm trying to engage. Please be as critical as possible, because it's something that is brewing in my mind. And every time I have presented something on this, it's the questions that have driven it further. So I look forward to that. And it is basically a set of propositions. Now, at the base issue is the question of reading that I'm concerned with. Now, it's been more than 3 decades that I've been in the field of Islamic studies, and almost everything that I've done has to do with reading texts and images. So today I will focus especially on reading of text, but this reading of text actually involves images, but modern photographic images that I will discuss. Now, so as a very base proposition, when we read something, the 2 things are involved. One is the ability to actually see the text, know the language, know the script, etc., and just to decipher at a very basic level because of literacy in the script that one is reading. And secondly, at a higher level, reading is about figuration. That is to say that what happens as one reads is when the words get connected together, sentences to paragraphs to pages and so on and so forth, gradually figures start appearing. Because as the content of the text accumulates in one's mind, it starts to take form. And those forms are figurations. So the actual information and the content of reading, especially a long text, actually happens through the process of figuration that was produced by the author and that is absorbed by the reader. So I'm particularly interested in this question of figuration, and that, as I will try to show. What the basic proposition is that figuration is very difficult to understand fully. And actually, as I look back at my own experience of reading Islamic texts over now decades at this point, what I find, and if I also look at our fields in which we read Islamic texts from the past, it's the lack of attention to figuration that has kind of stopped us from making other kinds of meanings or trying to understand what is actually happening in these texts in some ways. The most common way in which figuration does figure in what we read, etc., is through the question of literary genre. So one has to understand the genre in order to understand any text. That's a kind of a basic thing. But figuration is a larger framework around the question of genre. And I want to kind of expand it and say that if we become attuned to what is happening in terms of figuration in any kind of a text, it opens up in different ways. And the complexities that are embedded within it, whether due to authorial intent or due to intertextuality, there are other ways of getting at it. And for me, that is kind of opens up an imaginative way of reading these things. And as we open up new ways of imaginative ways of reading these texts, the societies from which they're coming also allow for a different type of imagination than what has been possible to retrieve from them, so on. So that's the ultimate aim here. And ultimately, the reason figuration is so crucial for my purposes is that aspects of text that have to do with intellectual content, ethical content, and aesthetic content, they have to do with figuration. If you can just read word by word a text, it will not actually reveal what is the intellectual, ethical, and aesthetic content of this text. It's that kind of content is actually beyond the words itself, and that is in the figurative aspects of the text. So that's the perspective I'm taking. Now, so I'll give you some examples. So, like, for example, this is the first page of a text that begins with the history of the East India Company in India. So if one reads only the words, as you can see here, just at the beginning, as one reads one word after the other, as sentence by sentence, the figuration starts to appear. The words by themselves don't mean anything, but from the way the first sentence is said, already it is projecting towards what the text is going to say about the significance of the history of the East India Company. So the text itself is 450 pages long of history of the East India Company over 220 years, right? So the two aspects of it have to work together in order for us to understand what is this history. So the history is actually in the figuration. It is not in the text as encountered on a very straightforward level. And that's the type of thing that one is I'm trying to look at. Now, and here then we can enter with photography. Now, on a basic level, if someone is giving us a history of 220 years of the East India Company, it looks like a timeline. And when you look at the table of contents of this book, it is a timeline. But when we actually pay attention to the way the history is told, it has ups and downs. It has all kinds of complications that happen, right? The timeline is the most basic form of configuration that we are very used to, that has been critical for the production of modern history since the middle of the 19th century at least, although the earlier understandings of it as well. But when we look at actually how historical narratives are constructed and absorbed, etc., it's never a straight line. It's actually a highly qualitative, highly inflected way of progression that is happening. So this is where something like this photograph I'm suggesting is helpful, because this is a photograph of a bridge that goes across from New Brunswick in Canada to Prince Edward Island. It's a 30-mile long bridge, so it's huge. And as one stands in front of it, it is a line, but it's this kind of up and down type of line, and the way this image actually conveys the sense of what this bridge is and what it is doing is what I'm trying to bring to thinking about text as well. And it's to correlate between these types of images constructed very specifically. All the images you'll see are my own, and they're constructed specifically to try to think about these things. Now, and one of the things that happens in a photograph like this is that it's deeply and profoundly anamorphic. Now, anamorphic means that it's deformed in some way. And anamorphic, all photographs are anamorphic from the basic reason that they convert a three-dimensional world into two dimensions. But in photography, since the invention of photography in the late 19th century, people have been very interested in very specific type of manipulations in order to create images that capture the world in a certain way, right? Like if we think about this example, this is a 30-mile long bridge, but here we can see it on such a small screen. Every pylon of this bridge is probably 5 times the size of the building at which we are standing, and yet we are somehow able to absorb it because of our minds and how they are interacting with this image. And from the image, we can actually go to certain understandings of what this building is, and so on and so forth. Something very similar happens with text when one reads a 450-page long book on history, is that very long history comes to be absorbed, be read through, and forming an image in our mind about what this world was in the short span of a few hours that it takes to read the books. Now, there's one crucial difference between text and image like this. In the text, you have to read through in time 450 pages to get the image. In a photograph, the image is immediate, right? So we can see the image as we have here. The figuration is the first thing that actually comes through. And then one can build a narrative about it. It can be, one can take apart this image and do all kinds of different things. So an image, particularly anamorphic photographic image versus a historical text, they do similar things, but they do it from the opposite sides. And my kind of proposition basically is to connect them together, to put the image first in order to understand what the figuration might be, or to extract the figuration then and use a photograph to try to correlate, to fully try to understand the types of things that are embedded within the configuration of a historical text. So that's the kind of the basic theoretical proposition. Now, what I'll do is I'll give you just one example of one text, and then show you what might be able to be done. So this is a text. It's 133 folios. It's at the British Library. It's by a man by the name of Karim Khan of Jhajjar outside of the city of Delhi. It's written in 1846. And the copy that is at the British Library, the one that I'm showing here, actually has the author's own stamps on it. So it's a very interesting artifact in itself. Now, the name of this text in Persian is Mirate Giti Numa, a world-revealing mirror. So it's an interesting way to think about how can a text be a mirror. This is a very common type of name for text in Persian and other related languages. But it's just to, if we kind of dig into this a little bit as to how can a text be a mirror, and what the immediate thing that comes to mind is a mirror has to do with images and interplay of images and anamorphism with respect to imaging. So these texts actually have a built-in understanding of figuration that I'm also trying to capitalize on in some way. Now, the story of this text is told within it, where the author says, so he is a noble person, an elite person from the city, around the city of Delhi, and he happens to be sent to London in 1841 for 2 years to try to fight a legal case in the British courts with respect to someone who employs him, who is a local ruler of a little piece of land, the Nawab of Jhajjar, outside of Delhi. Now, and he actually wrote a travelogue of this, which is also available to us, which is written in Urdu. This one is written in Persian. Now, when he goes back to Delhi, he has an encounter with Lord Hardinge, who is the Governor General of the East India Company at the time. And when he says in the text, when he has a conversation with Lord Hardinge, and the British official says to him, they're standing inside the ruins near the ruins of Delhi, the old great ruins of Delhi. And so the British official says to him, well, since you have seen London, it would be great if you can describe these ruins for people in London, right? So because you are one of the few people who've seen both sides. And of course, Englishmen write about this, but you as an Indian, why don't you write about these places that you've seen? Because you can compare them to what is in England. And so what he does then, he says that he thinks about this and he said, no, I'm not going to write that because that would be a type of domestication. But he says, I'm going to write a history and cosmology of the world as such. Right. So he says that, so this is the text that you are seeing here. It's to the whole cosmos, the whole world as it is, all parts of the world. Right. So he wants to, he basically says that, well, if the Europeans write about the world, so am I going to write about this? He, in a very interesting way, he refuses to just be an Indian author. He wants to be a global author, just as the Europeans are. Okay, so that's a very specific perspective and that is embedded in there. And throughout the text, this attitude towards knowledge and the world is embedded throughout this text. Right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, the other interesting thing that happens in this text, which is emblematic of much else that is produced in the same period, interestingly, is that it's intermingling and amalgamation of multiple systems of knowledge, which is in the early 19th century in India, this is all over the place and pretty much all over the world as well, wherever there is interaction with Europeans. But in India, because of the intensive colonization, that is very much there. And the easiest way to show this is that he says that I'm going to describe you and the world geographically. And what he does is to use he said there are many different systems of thinking about the world, but I'm going to use the European one, which is to divide the world into 4 continents. Interestingly, so the framework is European. The contents of those 4 continents are actually taken entirely from earlier Arabic and Persian sources, right? So it's this interesting case of old wine in new bottles. And in other places, by him, other authors as well, we have the other side as well, where we have new bottles, but or basically old bottles, but entirely new wine. So you have the relationship between containers of knowledge and the contents of knowledge is highly in flux in this period, and we can see this here very much in this text. Then he describes the world, and the 2 points of interest in the world are, of course, India and England. But specifically in England, it's the city of Delhi, which is where he's from. And then in England, it's the city of London, right? So there is a way in which it is the world, but it's a highly inflected world that is poised where the reference points are Delhi and London. And then the rest of the world is simply organized around it. So even though what we have is the claim of a generalized description of the world, it's actually a highly inflected understanding that has to do with his personal positioning with respect to the world. And then he has these very interesting things where one of the things that he says, which was all striking to me the first time I read this text, was where he says the Europeans have immense amounts of knowledge. They're far beyond knowledge in the knowledge that Indians have, but they're fundamentally unjust. And Indians don't have enough knowledge, but they're just. So it's an interesting comment, not to whether one accepts it or not, but the question of the relationship between knowledge and ethics runs throughout this text as well, right? And so all of these things that I've kind of laid out, that I've hinted at here, these are part of the figuration of this text. So it's one thing to describe a text like this that I have done for you, right? And this would be the normal way of dealing with something like this. But I'm interested in the figurative aspect. If we want to get to a sense of what is the kind of the intellectual, mental, psychological world of the person who might write a text like this, how can we kind of hold at the same time all these different aspects in our mind, right? So we can try to do it by reading the text and then telling you the story as I have done now. But if I try to narrate it as I've done even here, it again has to be put into time, and it's hard to then forget what aspect of the thing that is active at any given moment. So this is where the inverse relationship between photography and figuration in text I find helpful. So then I'm going to take you through a bunch of photographs to show what I mean by this. So this is a photograph of a backyard, and it's two trees with something in the middle. The something in the middle is actually the shadow of my own body holding the camera, right? So it's at the same time a scene of the world that a complicated scene. And if you can look very carefully, you'll see a dog there. So that identifies that it's a dog belongs to me and my family. But the author is constantly present as a shadow in everything that is said in this text. Now, in order to keep this idea alive, to be mindful of the fact that the author is authorizing everything that is being said. There's a volition involved, there's a perspective involved, there's an interest, a bias, etc. We can say it in text, but to convey it as a constant presence is very difficult in text. And oftentimes we acknowledge the bias and then we use the text for whatever purpose. But in an image, one can do this simultaneously. One can ignore the image, but it never leaves the sight, the shadow of my own body that is there, right? So, and that defines the fact that this image came into being because there was someone like me standing there using a machine to actually take this image, right? So this is where figuration in image can help us become sensitive to the perpetuity of figuration with respect to perspective, as we have here. So that's one type of image one might use. This is the different image. So this is just an image I took of the Shard while waiting at a train station in London. And so this is a really interesting case of a mirror. So the building itself becomes a mirror, but parts of the glass are a mirror and parts that are actually not a mirror. There's partly translucent, partly transparent, and partly mirroring. And the way the image is, it becomes hard to see what is the image and what is the reality. The crane that you can see here is only an image in the glass because we can't actually see the crane. But because the image is there, it's symptomatically present. In the same way that a text, when it makes claims about what happened 500 years ago, it's not that those 500 years, that time is actually available. It is imaged through another way in which it is showing up in this kind of text. So truth and the claim towards truth is produced through these imaging techniques, etc. And yet also what ends up happening is because you have many different sources that are producing the images, that are creating the text that is being produced, they're overlapping, they contradict each other, they distort each other in all kinds of ways. This is what we see in these texts, right? So we can never take apart all of what is feeding into a complex text because of the hundreds of sources that are going into it. We can try, when we try to do it in text, we can just put footnotes and such and so on. But in an image like this, it gives us a sense of how it's both representing and distorting at the same time in a deeply convoluted way. And the image can help to present this. The world that is being seen, as in this case in the offices in the Shard, it's peeping through from the inside out as well towards us. And then there are parts of the world that we cannot see that are reflected in the image that we are also seeing. And furthermore, the image exists because I was standing there. So it's something that I created. It's not just there as such. And I manipulated it in all kinds of different ways to create this particular thing to make the point about it, right? So it's this entanglement of the past, of that which is being seen, of the one who is seeing, which is as much part of text as of images that we can kind of see through this. Another way of this is just a photograph of a bunch of buildings in a downtown somewhere in the US. And here there are 7 different buildings that are overlapping in some way. They're hiding, they're showing all kinds of different things. And a lot of the time in complex texts, when there are multiple sources that are coming into it, they're doing something similar. where something is being brought and what is being chosen from something to be made represented inside a text, etc. What are the different angles at which things are introduced into that which is being produced? These are things that we can pick up by looking at very carefully at some text. And an image like this, for my purposes, helps us understand the complexity of the worlds that go into creating these types of texts, which is very easily to see in an image like this. And I will keep going. So this is a photograph, and all of these photographs are very ordinary. It's just that I've created them for purposes of thinking. So this is a photograph of the harbor of Oslo, right? And what is interesting about this is that the harbor is huge, right? So you can see in the far distance the very famous opera house that goes into the sea, and this huge place, the gargantuan buildings. But if you look at the way the image works, this bit of rope that is in the forefront, actually looks bigger than this huge area, right? And it has to do with the way the image is created, from where it is taken, and so on. So oftentimes, something similar happens in text, that which is of interest is made into something much grander in comparison and in contextualization with the larger world. But its significance actually derives from the way that it is imaged, and not so much that we can simply take it on face value and say, well, this is what the world was like, and so on, right? And it's the kind of play on the proportions and the kind of creation of a false perspective, which is the anamorphic aspect of something like this. And then I like this one also because then we have the mirror again as well here as well. So all of these things often are working together. Similarly, this is again, this is also in downtown, near the harbor in Oslo, and it's an ordinary day, and the sun is out, the clouds, but it can be made to look so dramatic because of these two figures that are in the square that on the top of this building, and the way they can be framed can make such a dramatic statement. And if you're walking around there, you don't see it. It's only in the creation of the image that something like this can be produced. So there again, how images can inflect in very particular ways how figuration happens. So this is the last image, this is again basically an image of simply this was a cupboard in a junk shop in Toronto, Canada. And so here we have a mirror, we have a doll, we have human-sized teacups. It's completely messed up in terms of the proportionality of what the things are. One figure is lying down, one is standing up. Where the image is, what the mirror is doing is very interesting in this case as well. And there are two images of the same body doing different things. And again, it produces a kind of cacophony of information, all of which is distortive in a curious sort of way. So for me, that these texts that I read, there's these types of cacophonies, and to understand them as to what's happening in them, this is where I find these images useful. Okay, so underlying this is this massive corpus. The reason I'm going into this is this massive corpus of texts produced in India between 1750 and 1850 in the high period of the East India Company, and in terms of its territorial expansion. And the history of this period for the East India Company is told largely through European documentation, but especially English. But underlying that is massive amounts of things that the Indians produced. And this material, some of these texts are 2,000 to 4,000 pages long. And they have these very complex worlds with all kinds of different information, knowledge, debates that are working through them. So it's partly trying to understand, make sense of these things, and to understand the worlds within which these are working, and not simply to describe them. That kind of led me to how to figure out more complex ways of thinking about text. That is, so I will leave that here now, but this is the reason I got into all this. So finally, why does this matter? So I'll just briefly end with this. One of this has to really to do with to try to find ways of managing this massive corpus and to say something about it that's not just straightforward description or cataloging. And the diversity of the data, especially in India, because it has so many different sources, languages, scripts, etc., is partly where the images comes in. There is other thing is that for me at least, visual elements such as photographs and the manipulated photographs of the type I've shown, they produce a kind of visceral understanding that goes beyond language in some way. And so I'm interested in thinking about this and thinking about how to use visual rhetoric as a form of analytical rhetoric in order to understand worlds, right? So one can use linguistic rhetoric to make an argument, but I think because of the way we can now create images in photography and use them, there is a way to create and to think, truly think, try to think visually and to create rhetoric through visual creation. Now, one can do this, of course, through painting and so on and so forth, but photography is much more like history because it does have to reflect a world that was there. There's a materiality to that which is imaged in photography, manipulated, transformed, deformed, and all kinds of things. But it's not like painting where it simply can be just invented on its own. And ultimately, also, I'm trying to use this to make a larger argument, which has to do with the theory and philosophy of history. And that has to do with the question of how do we understand what is historical truth? Now, when we look at the theoretical discussion about historical truth, and they often, almost always rely on other forms of truth, such as scientific truth, replicable truth in terms of experimental science, or philosophical truth using logic and so on and so forth. None of these actually satisfy when it comes to the specificity of how history and the past actually operate in human life. So my hope is to try to make an argument that historical truth is a particular type of truth. It's not simply invented. History is not something that it's not the same thing as a novel, even though it has lots in common with how novels work, certainly because of figuration and other things. But it has a specificity to it. And I want to be able to use this figuration and images to try to specify it, to get away from this idea that either somehow we know actually what happened or that we don't know anything at all. It's something else, and it's not in the middle. It's a categorically and qualitatively different way of understanding what truth might be that has to do with history. And this is kind of ultimately where I hope this project will lead. And I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bashir. I don't know if it's somehow what I was thinking about listening to you is that you're trying to define the nature of truth, which is in history, which is historical truth and somehow radically different from other kinds of truth or reality.
Yes.
Which, yeah.
And it's interrelated to other forms of truth, so it's not necessarily, maybe not radically different, but it is distinctive and different. Yeah.
And it's something to do with how the photographs reflect the world.
The photograph is an analogy for getting at it, in the same way text is analogical to that truth.
Yes, that's right. So what we see on the photograph is something that we can, I mean, not on all photographs, but in theory maybe, it is possible to go back and look at what is represented on the photograph in the real world. But in history, we don't have this possibility to go in the past.
Okay, actually, I'm glad you bring that up because I want to actually use the photographs exactly in the same way as we use history. It has no relation to what was there. It's the way the image is formed is what the issue is for me. It's not the history of what is being represented. The history is of 19th century India as seen in these photographs. So that's the distinction. So.
Right. Thank you. So we now I can pass the floor to our discussant, Professor Amanda Lanzilou. As you want, you can stay here.
Okay, great.
Or you can go.
Well, thank you so much for these really thoughtful and thought-provoking comments, Professor Bashir, and thank you for having me here today to discuss them with you. I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections as we go forth with all of the comments from the audience as well. So today, Professor Bashir invited us to question and challenge how we understand modes of representing the past, particularly in and through Indian Islamic texts. And he asked us to complicate how we write the cultural history of knowledge in India from the mid-18th to the mid-19th centuries by adopting a framework adapted from photography, by using photography as an analogy to understand the writing of history. And through this framework and analogy, Shahzad proposes we can begin to examine how history writing reflects and distorts, what it captures and excludes, and the ways that it both limits and expands our access to the forms of truth of the past. And as Shahzad has made clear throughout the presentation, seems to be an experimental approach to history, one which highlights the ways that historians' reading of text simultaneously reflect and distort forms of truth, past forms of truth. And so in my comments today, what I'm going to do is begin by laying out how I understand Shahzad's use of photography as analogy and the process of figuration in reading. And I'll focus particularly on where I see him applying the analogies of shadows, of mirrors, of amalgamation, and of proportion and perspective in his reading of Indian Islamic texts, and particularly the Mirate-Giti-Numa of Karim Khan. And then I'll return to the question of the relationship between the text as a source of history and the work of the historian who reads the text, asking whether we can layer our application of the analogy of photography to understand both our texts and our own work. And so what I'm most interested in of what I've heard thus far is the intersection of the consistent presence of the author of the historical text that we're reading and our own consistent presence as historians producing our own texts about the very text that we're reading. So it seems to be this almost cyclical process of what we might call photography. And so then relatedly, I'll end with a provocation, not only for Professor Bashir, but for us as a community of historians and scholars of the past more widely. And I'll ask how the analogies that we choose to use to describe history themselves produce, distort, and recreate historical categories. And so like Shahzad, I'll begin with shadows. And here he introduces us to the ways that the past and the future, the known and the unknown, presence and absence can be cast upon a text by its authors and readers. He suggests, for instance, that in the Mirate-Giti-Numa of Karim Khan, the supposed unknown geographies of Europe, Africa, and the Americas form a shadow upon the ostensible purpose of the text. So Shahzad's description of these shadows spurred me to think of my own personal interest in texts like this, particularly the disjuncture between the knowledge of the author and the knowledge of the intended readers. And so here I'd like to ask how shadows are cast differently depending on the readership, intended or otherwise, who in the end might have read the Mirate-Giti-Numa, besides perhaps us in the British Library, and what shadows might they have encountered. And so I also want to pose a slightly broader question and suggestion. Is there something distinctive about this period, the mid-18th to mid-19th century, and this type of text that imbues it particularly with shadows and renders it particularly important to study through conceptual photography? And so I'm thinking here about the fact that you sort of opened with that this period is one for historians of Islam in South Asia that lies under this long historiographical shadow of debates about the East India Company, and particularly debates about decline and dislocation, and the consolidation of colonial power and the place of Indian Muslims within that system. So can we read, do we read this shadow, particularly upon the Merathi Giti-Numa and texts like it? And so we also might here draw a connection to Shahzad's challenge of our assumption of chronology in historical knowledge. So how does the timeline that we project backwards, the timeline that is sort of the shadow for us that as we're reading the text, how does that differ from the chronology offered by the author and the chronology of his intended readership? And so mirroring, I think, to move to a second category, is the one with perhaps the most literal application between photography and Indo-Islamic texts because of the not infrequent use of Mirat as a title category for histories that provide systemic comprehensive knowledge. But Shahzad has asked us to look beyond this literal mirroring of language to understand the content and material functions of the text through the category of the mirror and the way that the past is simultaneously present and not present in a text. And so here I'll also pose a question, one which connects to some of my broader questions about this approach to reading texts. How do the material categories of the pages of the manuscript, as they might have been assigned or described by Karim Khan himself, intersect with the category of the mirror that we're using to describe both image and text? So where, for instance, do categories of hashia or like marginal annotation fit with the categories of like scale and of reflection as we look at them on the pages of the Merathi Giti-Numa in like sort of a very literal material sense? And then what about the work, the scribal work or the calligraphic work that we see upon the page? Can that too be explained through the mirror? Is that too sort of distorted in the way of a mirror? Or is the scribe's part of the world sort of also peeping through? And so I guess the bigger question here is, would Karim Khan have understood his text when framed in these terms? And does it matter? I think Indian Islamic texts are also, Professor Bashir shows us, amalgamated, demonstrating the multiplicity and contradictions within the text. So he reads Karim Khan's divide of the world into 4 continents and 7 climes, as an example of amalgamation and flux in the intersections of systems of knowledge, a sort of interlay. And this renders the Merathi Giti-Numa as an expansive source for contemporary historians. But it also means that I think in the past, like there's a decent amount of scholarship on the Merathi Giti-Numa, but it's often been studied in a piecemeal fashion, offering each individual historian a particular glimpse of the histories that we're hoping to capture. And so Shahzad might frame this, I think, as a lack of attention to figuration. And we can also consider the lack of immediacy in the text versus the image here. So how have those of us who have read portions of the Merathi Giti-Numa offered sort of a piecemeal and disconnected history, sort of insisting on an immediacy, departing from its full figure as a text? And then my other question here is, how do we understand amalgamation as a concept as extending beyond intertextuality? Is it simply that knowledge beyond the textual is also amalgamated? Or are there other ways that we can differentiate amalgamation and intertextuality? Are there other ways that they differ? And so this finally, I think, brings us to emphasis, foregrounding, and this play on proportions and perspectives. Another practice that we might also read as intersecting with the intertextual, but which I think Shahzad also reads as a process of emphasis within the cacophony of the text. And so here I'd like us to reflect a little bit on the interaction between the language of the text, so Persian, and the categories that their authors amalgamate. So in particular, just thinking about amalgamation offer us a path beyond debates about where and how Persian began to decline as a site of Indian production and creativity, particularly when we're thinking in this East India Company era, and to understand how the writing of Indian history in Persian was made anew in the mid-17th to mid-18th century period. And so can we find a space for the production of the new in a language that was associated with the courts of the past? And so I think throughout Professor Bashir's narrative, we've seen two overlapping stories of historical reflection and distortion. The first is the story of reflection and distortion within Shahzad's archive of the cultural history of knowledge within the text itself. And the second is the practice of reflection and distortion that we undertake as historians who attempt to read these texts in the present to draw out both the meanings and absences within them. And so in the Marathi Giti Numa, by way of example, Shahzad highlights the European framing of the text, which assumed an absence of knowledge beyond the local. Really, it kind of assumed that the author lacked knowledge beyond Delhi, or at least beyond India. But he also explored how Karim Khan reflected back onto his text an intermixture of European, Islamic, Indian, and other sources, rejecting that framing and filling his text instead with geography and history as he understood it. So does our knowledge of the political history of the British Empire in India post-1845 cast its own shadow upon our reading of the Marathi Giti Numa, and particularly upon Karim Khan's rejection of the assumptions of his British patrons, his rejection of domestication, and his insistence of writing globally? Right, so what are we reflecting from our present understanding of the sort of aftermath of the East India Company back onto the text? What about the shadows cast by our knowledge of the social history of the text? Does our knowledge of Karim Khan himself cast a shadow if we understand him as someone who moved flexibly between the elite and courtly cultures of the princely state of Jajjar, the remnants of the Mughal Empire in Delhi, and the British regime in India, right? He's intersecting with all of these three spaces, and we know that. But do we does that cast a shadow from us upon the text? Moreover, do we as the historian assign absences to a text like the Marathi Giti Numa, which we make, for instance, of his system of 4 continents and 7 claims, which include the Americas and make special space for England, but as far as I can tell, seem to leave out the Indian Ocean world, which was sometimes so integral to earlier Indian Muslim conceptions of geography. And so I'd like to suggest that the materiality of the texts as we encounter them today, when we perhaps read them here in the British Library, might also reveal the shadows and absences in our own knowledge of history. And so that brings me to my final concluding question. Shahzad suggested that these texts can be read as anamorphic, and perhaps that we clarify the image or narrative, its projections and its absences, when we read it through categories adopted from the visual, and particularly from photography, which has to reflect a world that was there, although with the rise of AI, I'm not sure if it does always anymore. And as he put it in his abstract for today, concept-driven photography provides a useful analogy for seeing how historians' narratives become containers for irreducibly complex worlds. So I'd like to conclude by asking him, and really all of us, to reflect on the container of photography as analogy. It allows us to read and deconstruct historical narratives while also producing new narratives for us, which create and distort in new and distinct ways. So to make things really meta, can we read Shahzad's writing of history as photography here today through these very categories of mirrors, of shadows, of amalgamation and perspective that he has demonstrated for us? Thank you.
Please, Shahzad, if you want to have any comments.
I asked a lot of questions.
Yes.
Most of them didn't.
Thank you. Actually, so most of those are fantastic questions, and in terms of the where you were pushing, so that makes absolute sense to me, and that's precisely where something that was essentially unsaid, which you actually lay out in those terms. So I will let them stand on their own. The one thread that runs through what you're saying is the question of the positionality of the historian or the author from that time and ourselves. So that is absolutely crucial, and that's precisely, I think, as you picked up, is what I'm trying to do, is to put oneself into not the world of the purported world of the person who wrote that thing, but the human situation of perplexity and necessity of saying something while not understanding, and so on and so forth. So in a way, I feel what I want to push is a kind of kinship for anyone, anywhere who writes history is stuck with these problems. And so but in order to understand ourselves and our own perplexity, especially, I mean, going to specifically to the Indian world, of trying to move away and beyond the post-colonial perspective to something other, where thinking via these texts and these individuals for whom we have traces is partly very much about the both the epistemological and ethical concerns of our own that are constantly impinging on us, right? So all the questions that you laid out, right? So those are absolutely perfect in terms of just amplifying what exactly is the issue here, whether particularly to this context or to history as such, and so on. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.